Geniuses and fools are two types of people who are often compared, as many believe their ways of thinking are surprisingly similar. There's even a saying that genius and foolishness are separated by only a thin line. But what truly sets them apart is an intriguing question. Understanding the difference between them isn't just intellectually interesting. It can also help us avoid becoming foolish ourselves. If fewer fools existed in society, that would certainly be a benefit to everyone. As someone who enjoys thinking deeply about such questions, I've decided to explore this topic. To find the answer, I believe we first need to understand the characteristics of human thought. The best way to uncover the distinction between genius and foolishness is to examine the differences between smart, clever, and wisdom, and then extend that understanding to the contrast between geniuses and fools. This video explains the distinctions among smart, clever, and wisdom, explores how they relate to the difference between genius and foolishness, and finally discusses how we can avoid becoming fools ourselves. Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. I am Eric, a cat who loved to think. I like to solve difficult questions. Here is the place I share and discuss my solution for the problems. The main goal of this channel is to find solutions, so I hope everyone can set aside their personal stance in order to listen and engage in meaningful discussion. This is all about my channel. Let's start to talk about today's topic. Smart, clever, and wisdom. 3 words often used to describe ways of thinking. At first glance, they may seem similar, but in fact, what each of them represents is quite different. Confusing these concepts can have a serious impact on a person's intellectual development. Among the 3, only one truly has a positive influence on the quality of our thinking. The other 2 are largely unrelated to whether our thoughts lead to good outcomes. However, many people strive to improve in these areas without realizing that progress in the wrong one may not lead to genuine personal growth. In some cases, it can even make things worse. These qualities are not completely independent. Strengthening one may come at the expense of another. If we sacrifice the one that positively affects our thinking in order to enhance the others, our thought processes can become distorted, which can be harmful. To prevent this kind of harm, it's essential to understand the differences between smart, clever, and wisdom. In the following section, I'll explain each one in detail. Of the 3 terms, the first one to discuss is smart. This word is generally used to describe someone who reacts quickly, someone whose mind is agile, who learns fast, or who can swiftly understand and handle problems. More specifically, when faced with a problem that most people are capable of solving, a clever person simply takes less time to reach a solution. For example, if you had to add together 5 4-digit numbers without using a calculator, the person who arrives at the correct answer fastest would typically be described as smart. However, it's important to note that being smart doesn't necessarily have a positive effect on the quality of one's thinking. In reality, many problems don't have an objectively correct answer as mathematics does. Making a decision is more like passing a football. There isn't one objectively right teammate to pass to, only an option that seems right. Likewise, when we call someone smart, we're often praising their ability to produce a seemingly correct answer quickly, even if that answer is actually wrong or deeply flawed. Because smart is a positive word, many people are eager to be seen as clever and to earn praise from others. The danger, however, is that in their effort to respond quickly, they may sacrifice careful thought. This can lead to poor decisions and negative consequences. The very harm that comes from blindly chasing after smart. To make the difference between smart and the other 2 qualities easier to understand, we can express the relationship between smart and thinking in simple terms. Smart is related to the speed of thought. In short, to be smart is to think fast. Having explained smart, it's time to move on to the second term, clever. This term is generally used to describe someone who can come up with ingenious solutions, someone who consistently solves problems or challenges in a creative and resourceful way. More specifically, when faced with a thinking problem, a clever person can propose a solution that most others would not have thought of, and that solution is often better and more practical. For instance, imagine trying to determine whether a 10-digit number is divisible by 3 without using a calculator. The person who doesn't simply divide the number by 3, but instead realizes that you can just add up all the digits to check divisibility, could be described as clever. However, just like smart, clever doesn't necessarily have a positive effect on the outcome of one's thinking. In real life, there is rarely an objectively correct answer. So what counts as better or more practical is subjective. Returning to the football analogy, if someone passes the ball to an unexpected position where no one was looking, creating an opportunity for a brilliant attack, that could be called a clever move. Yet, just as not every clever pass leads to a goal, not every ingenious idea produces good results. In fact, it can sometimes make things worse. The reason is that there's no objective standard for judging whether a method is truly better or more workable. Still, like smart, clever is often admired and pursued. More and more people today seek recognition for being original or unconventional, often by traditional approaches and presenting new methods in the hope of being praised for their ingenuity. But innovation for its own sake doesn't guarantee that an idea is actually better or more effective. The biggest danger in chasing clever lies in sacrificing thorough, careful thought in favor of novelty. And this pursuit can easily lead to poor decisions and negative outcomes. To make it easier to distinguish clever from the other two traits, we can express its relationship to thinking in simpler terms. Clever is related to the breadth of thought. The broader one's thinking, the greater the range of perspectives and possibilities one can imagine, the more clever that person appears. After all, only by thinking more broadly than most people can someone come up with solutions that others would never have considered. Having discussed smart and clever, you now come to the final term, wisdom. This word is generally used to describe someone with deep insight and sound judgment, someone who draws upon life experience, knowledge, and moral understanding to make thoughtful decisions about right and wrong, or about what truly matters in life. More specifically, when solving a problem, a wise person tends to offer the most reliable and balanced solution, one that can withstand different situations and uncertainties. For example, if asked to choose between buying 4 apples for £1 or 6 apples for £1, most people would immediately pick the 6. But a wise person would first ask about the apple's size, weight, and sweetness before deciding, ensuring they arrive at the most dependable answer. Unlike smart or clever, wisdom always has a positive effect on the quality of one's thinking. Although there may not be an objectively correct answer in real life, there is often an objectively sound one, the option that minimizes risk and leads to stable, consistent results. Returning to the football analogy, rather than making flashy moves or unpredictable passes, a wise player moves to the most open and advantageous position, making it easiest to receive the ball and create a scoring chance. This kind of steady, well-grounded action is the mark of wisdom. Yet, despite being a positive trait, wisdom is often misunderstood by those who claim to seek it. Some people, so-called midwits or pseudo-intellectuals, mistake the possession of knowledge for wisdom itself. They believe that having a vast store of information automatically makes them wise, and they try to prove their wisdom by showing off what they know. But this behavior actually reveals a lack of wisdom, because seeking praise is never the most stable or reliable way to act. True wisdom focuses on solving problems effectively, not on earning admiration. Moreover, the wisest solutions are often the traditional ones, those refined through time and experience. But if someone's goal is to stand out or impress others, they may feel pressure to propose something new simply for the sake of novelty. This often leads to unsteady, impractical ideas, the opposite of wisdom. To make the distinction clearer, we can express the relationship between wisdom and thinking in simple terms. Wisdom is related to the depth of thought. Deeper thinking reflects greater wisdom. And how can we tell whether someone's thinking is deep? The simplest test is to see how easily they're satisfied with their own answers. A wise person is rarely content with their first answer. They revisit it, test it, and examine whether it's truly the most reliable choice. Those without wisdom, however, stop at the first seemingly good answer. The effort and care one invests in rethinking and refining an idea, that is the measure of the depth of thought, and thus, of wisdom itself. Having explained the differences between smart, clever, and wisdom, it's time to explore the distinction between genius and foolishness. Both geniuses and fools can be smart or clever, because what primarily distinguishes them is the outcome of their actions. Since smart and clever are not directly related to the correctness of outcomes, both traits can appear in either group. For instance, both a genius and a fool might give an answer to a problem with remarkable speed. But only the one who gives the correct answer would be called a genius, while the one who gives the wrong answer would be called a fool. Similarly, both might produce ideas that are highly original, beyond what most people would imagine. But again, only the correct idea marks genius, while the mistaken one reveals foolishness. This shows that the speed or breadth of thought does not determine whether someone is a genius or a fool. The key difference lies instead in the accuracy or soundness of their conclusions. And the factor that most strongly influences the correctness of an answer is the depth of thought. In other words, wisdom. Therefore, I believe the real difference between genius and foolishness lies in whether or not a person possesses wisdom. Once this hypothesis is established, we can test it. First, can a fool with wisdom exist? Since wisdom is what guides a person toward the most reliable, well-reasoned answer, and since reliable answers tend to be correct, a person who is truly wise cannot be a fool. Thus, a wise fool does not exist. Next, can there be a genius without wisdom? I would argue no. If we look at figures in history who are recognized as geniuses in their respective fields, we find that they share a common trait. They are never satisfied with the first answer they find. Scientists, for example, are driven by an unending curiosity and a refusal to settle for incomplete explanations. Their pursuit of deeper understanding is a hallmark of wisdom. Military geniuses rarely stop refining their strategies after a single success. Their constant search for improvement is what makes them formidable. Likewise, artistic geniuses are never content with repeating what already exists. Their dissatisfaction with the status quo leads to innovation and greatness. Even if some geniuses might lack wisdom in other areas of life, it is difficult to deny that within their fields of genius, they exhibit a form of wisdom, a capacity for deep, reflective, and self-questioning thought. Therefore, based on these points, it is reasonable to conclude that the true distinction between a genius and a fool lies in whether or not they possess wisdom. After understanding the difference between geniuses and fools, the next question naturally arises. How can we avoid becoming fools? Since fools are people who lack wisdom, This question can be reframed as, how can one develop wisdom? And anyone who is truly wise, when faced with this question, would begin by asking another. Can wisdom actually be developed? Because if wisdom cannot be trained or cultivated, then the question of how to train it has no meaningful or objective answer. And discussing a question that has no answer is simply a waste of time, which itself would be an unwise thing to do. So, can wisdom be developed? I believe it can. Let's start with the common image we have of wise people. They are often elderly. This association exists because older people usually have more life experience to draw upon. However, not all elderly people are wise, which means that the passage of time alone does not automatically produce wisdom. What this suggests is that while wisdom tends to accumulate over time, it is not time itself that creates it. Rather, it's what is accumulated during that time that matters. The fact that older people are generally seen as wiser than younger ones implies that wisdom can indeed be built up through experience and reflection. And if wisdom is something that can be accumulated, then it must also be something that can be trained or strengthened deliberately. In other words, although not everyone who grows older becomes wise, we can find ways to accelerate the process of accumulation, to deliberately gather the experiences, insights, and habits of thought that foster wisdom. Therefore, I believe wisdom can be trained. So how should we actually train wisdom? I believe we can find the answer by analyzing the different ways geniuses and fools think. One key difference is that geniuses think in pursuit of better outcomes, whereas fools think in pursuit of outcomes more beneficial to themselves. At first glance, these two goals might seem similar. After all, what benefits oneself often overlaps with what produces good results. But the difference between them is in fact profound. Take, for example, the act of sharing knowledge. Both wise people and midwits or pseudo-intellectuals tend to share what they know. However, their motivations and judgment differ greatly. The wise share knowledge only with those who genuinely desire or need it, because doing so leads to better results, helping others effectively without wasting effort or provoking resistance. Pseudo-intellectuals, on the other hand, share their knowledge indiscriminately, even with those who neither seek nor value it, because their real goal is self-benefit, to appear intelligent or to gain admiration. The outcome is that the wise improve understanding and relationships, while the pseudo-intellectuals often create frustration and alienation. This is why midwits and pseudo-intellectuals, despite appearing learned, often come across as foolish. They prioritize what flatters themselves rather than what truly produces a good result. Another major difference is that wise people value foundations and completeness of information, while fools neglect them. A solid foundation and full, accurate information are essential for sound thinking, because they shape the direction in which better results can be found. Consider something as simple as buying a car. A wise person, before offering advice, would first ask about your purpose for buying, your budget, and your personal needs. Only after understanding these factors would they suggest the most suitable option. A foolish person, on the other hand, would immediately recommend what they personally believe is the best car without considering whether it fits your situation or whether you can even afford it. This example shows that wisdom grows from the habit of seeking complete, relevant information and focusing on what truly leads to the best overall outcome, not what merely feels most rewarding or self-serving. Fools tend to favor yes or no questions when they think, while wise people prefer specific, targeted WH questions. Clearest example is when deciding whether a policy or proposal should be implemented. A foolish mindset focuses narrowly on the single question, should we do this or not, and devolves into arguing for or against the proposal in isolation. A wise thinker, by contrast, asks why the proposal should be implemented, how it ought to be implemented, and what the likely consequences will be. And is by answering those questions that they reach a judgment about whether to proceed. This difference arises because wise people hold two important concepts: that the method of implementation affects the outcome, and that an outcome can diverge from the original intention. They therefore use questions about purpose, method, and consequence to explore a proposal thoroughly. Foolish people rarely grasp these concepts. They treat implementation-related effects or misalignments between intent and outcome as accidents. That is why fools repeatedly make the same mistakes and earn the reputation of being foolish. Without recognizing how method shapes results, or that results can contradict intentions, you are likely to implement ideas that produce poor outcomes. Yes or no questions also tend to oversimplify thinking by collapsing several different dimensions into a single binary indicator, which corrupts the information used in reasoning. Imagine 3 trains, 2 of which reach the destination. If you think only in yes or no terms, you might quickly conclude which train is right without considering other affecting factors such as schedule, speed, or interchange options. By using specific WH questions instead, you are less likely to discard relevant information. You can gather and fill in missing details, arrive at a more complete assessment, and therefore produce more robust decisions and better results. On the other hand, I describe wisdom in terms of depth of thought. A wise person, when answering a question, is able to provide reasonable and detailed explanations for their conclusions. This shows that when they think, they are not merely concerned with reaching an answer, but with exploring the reasoning behind it, thinking beyond the surface of the question itself. By contrast, those who lack wisdom tend to give only the direct answer to a question. If you ask them to elaborate or to explain the reasoning behind their response, they often cannot answer immediately. This reveals that their thinking stopped at the point of finding an answer, without delving any deeper into the issue. This illustrates what depth of thought really means. It refers to where a person stops thinking. If someone stops as soon as they reach an initial answer, that is shallow thinking. Deep thinking, on the other hand, begins when a person refuses to be satisfied with a simple or immediate answer. In other words, rather than assuming their first answer is correct, they continue to question it, test it, and seek further evidence until they are genuinely confident it holds up. The less easily one is satisfied with an answer, the deeper their thinking, and the greater their wisdom. In the process of verifying an answer, a wise thinker naturally searches for additional relevant information, refines their reasoning, and even considers what might happen if their answer turns out to be wrong, along with how to respond in that case. Through this process, a person who thinks deeply arrives at more reliable and well-grounded conclusions, which is why they are recognized as truly wise. Once we have a general understanding of how wise people think, we can begin to summarize the methods for cultivating wisdom. In essence, the process can be broken down into 2 main practices. First, to make your thinking deeper, you must develop the habit of questioning your own answers, even deliberately forcing yourself to do so. Every time you arrive at an answer, pause and consciously challenge it. No matter how correct or convincing it may seem, you should still ask yourself whether it truly holds up. Questioning an answer is not the same as denying it. To question is to re-examine your answer from several perspectives. For example, whether it could be improved, whether it might be wrong in certain circumstances, or whether it could be entirely mistaken. To deny an answer, on the other hand, is simply to reject it outright, which is not a sign of deep thinking. True questioning involves exploration, not negation. By repeatedly questioning not only your original answer, but also the new answers that arise from your questioning, you build layers of reflection. When done appropriately, this process leads naturally to deeper thought and greater wisdom. Second, cultivate the habit of using specific WH questions in your thinking and reduce your reliance on simple yes-no questions. Relying too heavily on yes-no thinking diminishes wisdom because the answers it produces carry little information. When circumstances change, it becomes difficult to infer new, context-appropriate answers from such limited responses. This reflects shallow thinking. WH questions, on the other hand, carry far more information. Even when the environment changes, the insights gained from them remain applicable. This shows deeper, more adaptable thought. However, this doesn't mean that yes-no questions should never be used. They can also support deep thinking when used in nested form. That is, by combining several yes-no questions to refine understanding. For instance, consider the yes-no question, should we carry out this plan? We can add another layer, such as, are the necessary preconditions for implementing this plan in place? This nested questioning adds context, brings in more information, and shifts focus toward the real issue. Often, whether a decision should be executed depends not on the decision itself, but on whether its prerequisites are met. If they are, execution makes sense. If not, it becomes impossible. Foolish people who rely solely on single yes-no questions tend to fixate on whether or not to act, ignoring the conditions required to make the action viable. This leads to poor judgment and failed decisions. By mastering these two habits, consistently questioning your answers and favoring specific, layered questioning over simplistic binary thinking, you can steadily deepen your thought, cultivate genuine wisdom, and ultimately, avoid becoming a fool. Although wisdom can be cultivated, unfortunately, the changes in our modern society are gradually making people less and less wise. First, the way people play and entertain themselves has changed. The rise of mobile games has caused people to lose one of the easiest and most natural ways to train their wisdom through play. Traditional games once required players to think, to strategize, calculate, predict, and respond. And all of these processes exercise deep thinking. Even early video games, though simplified compared to traditional ones, still demanded a certain degree of reasoning and planning. But mobile games have taken this simplification even further, transforming play into a purely mechanical or reflex-based activity that requires thought at all. If you compare traditional games, early video games, and today's mobile games, the difference is striking. Traditional games such as chess, Go, or even simple card games constantly require analysis and foresight. Many of these games train wisdom precisely because they demand active, thoughtful engagement. Modern video games, in contrast, have increasingly shifted their focus to accessibility, making games easier to pick up by removing complex decision-making. Mobile games, being designed for convenience and short bursts of play, have become even more simplified and repetitive. They require almost no thought to play, thus completely losing their ability to train wisdom. Second, the growing convenience of modern life has reduced the need for deep thinking in everyday situations. In the past, before the internet and digital devices became common, people had to rely on their own judgment and reasoning for tasks such as reading maps, planning routes, and adapting to changes. Today, with technology handling everything for us, Many people have lost these basic cognitive skills. A clear example can be seen in how some drivers behave. When they miss an exit on the highway, instead of calmly finding an alternate route, some will dangerously attempt to reverse on the highway, a clear sign of poor judgment. This happens because convenience has made people forget the importance of careful thinking and preparation. They no longer consider potential mistakes or how to recover from them. This mindset, the belief that one can live without needing to think deeply or seek the most stable solutions, leads people to ignore and even dismiss wisdom itself. Third, there is a growing emphasis on emotion-based values, prioritizing how people feel over what is true or reasonable. Emotions are subjective indicators, whereas wisdom often depends on objective evaluation. Subjective thinking does not require reasoning. It simply reacts, pursuing only emotional satisfaction, therefore, is essentially the rejection of thought. As a result, those who focus solely on emotional values often appear unwise to others. A society that encourages emotional expression over rational reflection may seem more empathetic on the surface, but it also risks producing people who lack depth, stability, and discernment, the very qualities that define wisdom. In short, while wisdom can be trained, the structure of modern life, through entertainment that discourages thought, convenience that removes the need for reasoning, and values that glorify emotion over intellects, is quietly eroding the opportunities for people to practice it. Lastly, I believe that as society continues to change, most people will gradually become more foolish. Because of this, I think that understanding the difference between geniuses and fools is becoming increasingly important. Through this video, I hope to spark a discussion about what truly separates a genius from a fool. If you agree with the ideas shared in this video, or if you know someone who might benefit from hearing them, I invite you to share with them. That's all for this video. Thank you for your watching. If you like this video, please like, subscribe, and comment. Every like, subscribe, and comment are a contribution to solving those difficult questions. For comments, please remember to follow the rules outlined in the description to help maintain a healthy and respectful discussion environment. I look forward to your joining our discussion and making a contribution to solving the difficult questions. Once again, thank you for your watching. Goodbye.